Hello everyone, welcome to this lecture on structural meaning of culture. This lecture is part of your paper, Media and Globalization. In this lecture you will learn the structural conception of culture. Structural conception of culture, which is built on the criticism of Clifford Geertz's symbolic conception of culture, is a synthesis of various critical approaches to culture. Therefore, it is a distinctive concept. Keeping this in mind, we will first discuss the criticism of Clifford Geertz. In the second part of the module, we will explain structural conception of culture as propounded by British sociologist and media theorist John Thompson. We will learn a holistic conceptualization of culture that is built on the symbolic conception of culture and takes into consideration all the critical approaches. You will be able to define culture with all its modern or contemporary underpinnings. The symbolic conception of culture paved the way for the structural conception of culture that was developed by British sociologist John Thompson, who is a renowned media theorist too. Thompson developed this alternative structural conception of culture in his book Ideology and Modern Culture. His structural conception emerges from the critical hermeneutics. His critical hermeneutics is an appealing effort to synthesize various critical approaches to culture, such as the Frankfurt School, the semiology and British cultural studies. It shifted the earlier focus on consciousness and individual to the structure, and that's why it is termed as structural conception. Thompson mainly builds on Geertz's conception. He criticizes Geertz for not giving attention to the problems of power and social conflict. He argues that Geertz views cultural phenomena as meaningful constructs and symbolic forms, and the analysis of culture is limited to interpretation of the patterns of meaning embodied in these forms. Well, according to Thompson, cultural phenomena are embedded in power relations. Geertz completely ignores the aspect of hierarchy and power relations in society. Thompson exposes that cultural phenomena are produced, transmitted, and received in structured social context. Thompson's structural conception of culture takes into consideration both the symbolic character of cultural phenomena and their social context. According to the definition that you see in the first image, cultural phenomena are to be seen as symbolic forms of structured social contexts. To carry out a cultural analysis, the social scientists need to elucidate two things. One, the meaningful constitution of symbolic forms, and two, social contextualization of symbolic forms. Now let's talk about the structural conception of culture. Cultural analysis is the study of symbolic forms, that is, meaningful actions, objects, and expressions of various kinds in relation to the historically specific and socially structured context and processes within which and by means of which symbolic forms are produced, transmitted, and received. According to Thompson's, symbolic forms can be considered as meaningful social phenomena by virtue of a few characteristics. At this stage, please note when we use the term symbolic form, it refers to a broad range of meaningful social phenomena such as rituals, utterances, gestures, texts, mass media, and any other form of art. There are 5 aspects that are involved in the constitution of symbolic forms and their social contextualization. All these aspects have to do with meaning, sense, and significance. These aspects are: 1. Intentional aspect. Can you call the natural patterns as symbolic forms or art? By natural pattern, we mean sky, cloud, mountain, river. The answer to this question is simple. Natural patterns are not symbolic forms, as any natural pattern becomes symbolic form only when it is expressed by human beings in painting, poem, or any other form. Nature in itself doesn't become artistic symbolic form until it is mediated by human intervention. This is exactly what is meant by intentional aspect of symbolic form. That is, symbolic forms are expressions of people for other human beings. This means that first of all, symbolic forms are produced, constructed, or employed by human beings. Second, human beings express themselves through such symbolic forms thus produced. But imagine a situation that a painter made a painting and kept it in a dark room without showing it to any other human being. Would you call it an art? Well, any symbolic expression becomes meaningful only when we express our intentions and meanings for other human beings. Subsequently, those people receiving and interpreting the symbolic forms perceive it as the expression of a human being. We would not make a mistake of believing that the intention of the producer of the symbolic form is identical with its interpretation by other subjects. So, producer's subject's intentions cannot be taken as the touchstone of interpretation. In communication studies, various attempts have been made to analyze meaning in terms of producer subject's intentions. At a broader level, the producer subject's intentions have been studied as part of the concept of ideology. Ideology has been taken up in the analysis of symbolic forms as a central aspect by the Frankfurt School. Since you will study about it in this course, without going into details of their work, let us mention that their work was criticized for the reason that they did not pay attention to the divergent decoding of the products of cultural industry. Now, the second one is the conventional aspect. The reason why producer subject's intentions cannot be taken as touchstone of interpretation is because people employ different sets of rules, codes, or conventions of various kinds in both production and reception of the symbolic forms. So, encoding and decoding are not inevitably identical. Decoding is never a conscious act. We decode meanings using taken for granted schema of tacit knowledge that we employ in our everyday lives. We can call them flexible schemata, which orient individuals in the course of their everyday lives. We learn such practical knowledge in the process of socialization. Stuart Hall from Birmingham School of Cultural Studies in the UK is the renowned critical cultural theorist who analyzed in this line of argument the cultural transmission through technologically advanced means of communication. He developed an encoding-decoding model of communication in 1973 in his essay titled Encoding and Decoding in Television Discourse. Well, he argued that people not passively consume the ideological messages of symbolic forms. According to him, there is a lack of fit between the moment of production called encoding and the moment of consumption or reception called decoding. He said that people can have entirely oppositional decoding or interpretation of the dominant ideology or encoding of symbolic forms. So, while accepting that there is dominant ideology encoded, Stuart Hall gives attention to people's oppositional readings that may give birth of countercultural process in any society. The third is structural aspect. The structural aspect studies the dominant ideology manifested in the structure of symbolic forms. The structure of symbolic forms is seen as the structure of language. Language is studied as a symbolic system by Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, who is the founding figure of semiology. Saussure said that the meaning of word exists only within a language system where words stand in relation to each other. For him, the meaning derives only from the language system within which we speak, write, and think. Drawing from Saussure, Thompson argues that symbolic forms also have elements that stand in relation to each other to form a structure. All these elements are called structural and Systemic Features by Thompson. You may try to understand the structural and system elements through the example of a game. In a game such as poker, you have the liberty of using your hand the way you want, but still you have to abide the rules of the games. Same applies to symbolic forms. Let's understand the structural aspect through the analysis of some images. These are the images from an advertisement for air conditioning units. The advertisement presents two different pictures with a caption before the first image and after the second image. In the first image, an old sadhu is lying outdoors of a bed of nails next to a wall covered with Hindi film posters. In the second image, in place of the bed of nail, you can see a cushioned bed. Now it's an indoor setting with a bedroom which is decorated with furniture, lamp and plant. Along with that, the sunlight doesn't fall on him directly but filtered through sloping skylights. According to Lila Fernandez, who has discussed this advertisement in her book India's Middle Class, the images present us with a striking representation of the contrast between the modern and the traditional. Sadhu signifies India's tradition, as Orientalist philosophers have defined India as a land of holy man, exotic religious practices and poverty. But with the introduction of modern consumer items like air conditioner, the outer material conditions can be changed without displacing the inner spiritual essence of India. Therefore, the sadhu remains the same in both images, but his outer material conditions have changed. The images provide a visual embodiment of the ways in which the emergence of Indian national identity rested on the preservation of a protected inner sphere of a Hindu tradition that could accept Western standards of progress and development without changing its own cultural ethos. If we try to change any aspect in any of the images, do you think there will be a change in the way we perceive the meaning of the image? Let us replace the bed of nails in the first image with the bed in the second image. Does it disturb the internal structure of the symbolic form? Or what if we remove the furniture and plants from the second image? Will it affect your understanding of that image? Why do you think the sadhu is not clad with some more clothes in the second image? The very juxtaposition of images forms the structure through which the meaning of the message is conveyed. You may answer these questions in different manner depending on your social location. There is a limitation of such kind of analysis. This will produce never existing meanings. It is only with the referential and contextual aspect that we can reduce the possibility of numerous meanings. A second aspect in which the analysis of structural features and symbolic elements is limited is this. By focusing on the internal constitution of symbolic forms, this kind of analysis not only neglects the referential aspect of symbolic forms, but also abstracts from the socio-historical context and processes within which these forms are embedded. The analysis of structural features and systemic elements thus disregards the contextual aspect of symbolic forms. Both these limitations are compensated by referential aspect and contextual aspects that we are discussing now. Now let us discuss the fourth one, the referential aspects. The symbolic forms are not only concatenations of elements and their interrelations, they are also typically representations of something. They present or portray something. They say something about something. This characteristics of symbolic forms is called referential aspect that cannot be grasped by the analysis of structural features and systemic elements alone. Grasping the referential aspect of a symbolic form requires a creative interpretation which moves beyond the analysis of internal features and elements and which seeks to explicate what is represented. In some way, it is explained in semiology through the concepts of signifier and signified. The referential aspect regards that the symbolic forms are constructions which typically represent something, refer to something, say something about something. This means that a symbolic form represents some object, individual, or state of affairs in a certain context. For instance, in the above image, sadhu is the signifier of Indian tradition. The contextual aspect is the fifth characteristic of symbolic forms. This means that symbolic forms are always embedded in specific social historical context and processes within which, by means of which, they are produced, transmitted, and received. Even a simple utterance in our daily conversations is located in specific social historical context. For instance, the accent, mode of address, choice of words, style of expression, all these are conditions historically. Similarly, more complex symbolic forms such as television program or films are generally presuppose a range of specific institutions within which and by which they are produced, transmitted, and received. Such institutional apparatus works with a fixed motif. You may refer to Thompson's recent book, Merchants of Culture, to understand the nuances of this argument. So, contextual aspect moves beyond present and highlight the significance of history to deconstruct the meanings. By way of such socio-historical contextual analysis, we can say that the possibility of multiple interpretations with us away. In highlighting the contextual aspect of symbolic forms, we are moving beyond the analysis of the internal structural features of symbolic forms. Let's try to understand this point through an example. Do you know that when people were protesting against the rape of Nirbhaya case in Delhi, the newspapers and television reported a statement such that, within quote, rapes occur in India, not in Bharat. Now, if you look at the internal structure of this sentence, you may not get any idea of the meaning of this sentence, as Bharat is commonly used as the Hindi translation of India. The moment you go beyond the internal structure of the sentence and look out at the political scenario in India, you will understand that the word Bharat signifies the tradition or the Sanskriti of our country, and India signifies degenerated, westernized country. Well, the embedding of symbolic forms in structured social context implies two things. First, they are not just expressions of people, but also of their specific social historical context. People are equipped with resources and capacities of various kinds. Therefore, symbolic forms carry the social conditions of their production. At the same time, their consumption also carried within a specific socio-historical context. Hence, the production and consumption is not an innocent or neutral process. There are certain characteristics, such social contexts, which are involved in this process of production and reception. Let's look at those characteristics one by one. Well, to start with, there are mainly two characteristics of social context that play a significant role in the production and reception of symbolic forms of any kind. The first is the use of valuable resources by individuals situated at certain positions within a field or institution. The position of the individual is determined by the volume and distribution of various kinds of resources that can be called capital. Such capital is of three kinds: economic capital, which includes property, wealth, and financial assets of various kinds; cultural capital, which includes knowledge, skills, education qualifications; and symbolic capital, which includes the accumulated status, prestige, and recognition associated with a person or position. The possession of any of these or all forms of capital will determine how effectively an individual is able to produce and transmit any symbolic form. In today's world, cultural transmission is controlled by institutional apparatus such as publishing houses, film production houses, distributors, and many others. Along with the use of resources, individuals also draw upon rules and conventions of various kinds, about which we have already discussed. The process of reception of symbolic forms is not a passive process of assimilation. It is rather a creative process, interpretation and evaluation. In this process, the meaning of a symbolic form is actively constituted and reconstituted. Individuals are not passive receivers, but they actively create and recreate meanings in the process of consumption. Well, this ongoing process of constituting and reconstituting meaning is part of the symbolic reproduction of social contexts. This means that this circle of construction and reconstruction of meanings helps in the survival of society. This process may serve to sustain and reproduce the existing context of production and reception, which includes asymmetrical relations. At this point of the discussion of symbolic forms rejoins the problem of ideology. The study of ideology in this context is the study of the ways in which the meaning mobilized by symbolic forms serves to establish and reproduce the existing social relations, which are systematically asymmetrical in terms of power. One consequence of the contextual embedding of symbolic forms is the processes of valorization, that is, the processes through which the symbolic forms are ascribed certain kinds of value. There are two significant ways in which symbolic forms are subjected to valuation, evaluation and conflict. The first is symbolic valorization. It's a process through which symbolic forms are ascribed a certain symbolic value by the individuals who produce and receive them. Symbolic value is the value that objects have by virtue of the ways in which they are esteemed by the individuals who produce and receive them. Symbolic value is different from economic valorization, which is a process through which symbolic forms are ascribed a certain economic value. It's a value for which symbolic forms are exchanged in a market. It's the economic valorization that transforms symbolic forms into commodity. Such commodified symbolic forms are called symbolic goods. Both types of valorizations are accompanied by distinctive forms of conflict. Symbolic forms may be ascribed different degrees of symbolic value by the individuals who produce and receive them, in such a way that an object which is praised by some may be denounced or despised by others. This is the conflict of symbolic valuation. Such conflicts always take place within a structured social context which is characterized by asymmetries. Therefore, the symbolic valuation offered by different individuals who are differentially situated are rarely of equal status. Some valuations carry more weight than others by virtue of the individual who offers them and the position from which he or she speaks. Prestige and status not only ascribe weightage but also legitimacy in the eyes of others who are receiving them. Similarly, conflict of economic valuation takes place in structured social context in which some individuals may be able and willing to pay more than others in order to acquire or control symbolic goods. With the growing commodification of symbolic forms and their incorporation into institutions of mass communication, most conflicts of economic valuation take place within an institutional framework comprised of media organizations. These valorizations are routinely concerned with the economic valorization of symbolic forms and with the resolution of conflicts of economic valuation. So, for instance, in producing a symbolic good such as a book, a publishing organization or the publisher is transforming a symbolic form into a commodity and offering it for exchange in a market. Depending on the anticipated sale of the book, the publisher will generally ascribe a certain economic value to the symbolic form, an ascription which may differ from the ascription of others, such as authors and agents. Such conflicts of economic valuation are routinely confronted and resolved as part of the everyday operation of media organizations. Both these valorizations and conflict of valorization overlap in actual circumstances. In some cases, the acquisition of symbolic value may increase the economic value of a symbolic good. For instance, paintings by renowned printers, films by popular directors, books by well-known authors indicate this direct relationship between economic and symbolic value. Cross-valorization is a strategy used by advertisers, which means they use symbolic value to either increase or decrease the economic value of the symbolic good. It can be the other way around, where they use economic value to increase or decrease the symbolic value of a symbolic good. For instance, when advertisers use well-known film stars, cricketers, or any other public figures to promote their product, the aim is to increase sales by associating with a figure of high symbolic value. So friends, in this lecture we have learned the structural conception of culture, as it is a distinctive conception and it provides a relevant framework for the analysis of cultural transmission through mass media. The structural conception of culture emphasizes on the meaningful constitution and social contextualization of symbolic forms. You have learned that the meaningful constitution of symbolic forms can be grasped by examining the intentional, conventional, structural, and referential aspects of symbolic form. The social contextualization takes place beyond the deconstruction of internal structure of symbolic forms by paying attention to social aspects of contexts, processes, and valorization and modalities of cultural transmission. The structural conception allows the possibility of analyzing the oppositional interpretations of the dominant apparatus. Hence, it addresses the social movements questioning dominant cultural transmission and arguing for an alternative mechanism. This brings us to the end of our lecture. So for more details on the topic, please refer to the e-text of this lecture and the extended reading list provided with it. Also, please try to attempt the questions given at the end of your text. Thank you very much indeed.